as a corpse cannot hear a conversation in the mortuary, the person who is spiritually dead in his trespasses and sins cannot hear or understand the things of God, no matter how loudly or clearly they may be declared or evidenced in his presence. Sin has a petrifying effect, and the heart of the person who continually chooses to sin becomes hardened and paralyzed to spiritual truth, utterly insensitive to the things of God. Satan plays a part in the blindness of those who refuse to believe, because the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelieving, that they might not see the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God, 2 Corinthians 4:4. They refuse to see Christ because they refuse to see God, and their refusal is readily confirmed and reinforced by the God of this world. And when men continually persist in following their own way, they will also eventually be confirmed in their choice by the God of heaven. But though he had performed so many signs before them, John tells us, yet they were not believing in him. For this cause they could not believe, for Isaiah said again, he has blinded their eyes, and he hardened their heart, lest they see with their eyes and perceive with their heart, and be converted and be healed. John 12:37-40. Because they would not believe, they could not believe. God one day says, let the one who does wrong still do wrong, and let the one who is filthy still be filthy. Revelation 22:11. When men choose to constantly reject the light, they became darkened in their understanding, excluded from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them, because of the hardness of their heart. That is the tragedy of unbelief, the tragedy of the person who makes himself his own God. The third characteristic of the unregenerate person is spiritual and moral callousness. They become callous. When people continue to sin and turn themselves away from the life of God, they become insensitive about moral and spiritual things. They reject all standards of righteousness and do not care about the consequences of their unrighteous thoughts and actions. Even conscience becomes scarred with tissue that is not sensitive to wrong. 1 Timothy 4:2 and Titus 1:15. Our wicked society is so determined not to be cut out for what it is, that it stands unflinching as its very life is ripped apart by the sins and corruption it holds so dear. It has become callous both to reality and to the consequences of sin, and will endure any agony rather than admit that its way of living is the way of death. On the other hand, sins that were once hidden or excused are now indulged in openly and blatantly. When self-desire rules, indecency runs wild and proceeds to callous the conscience, the God-given warning light and pain center of the soul. Those who are dying are desensitized to that which is killing them because they choose it that way. Even when held up shamefully in view of the world, their sins are not recognized as sinful or as the cause of their meaninglessness, hopelessness, and despair. Romans 1:32. They're depraved in mind. Futile, self-centered thinking, ignorance of the truth, and spiritual and moral callousness lead inevitably to sensuality, for the practice of every kind of impurity with greediness. Sensuality refers to total licentiousness, the absence of all moral restraint, especially in the area of sexual sins. The idea is that of unbridled self-indulgence and undisciplined obscenity. Sensuality characterizes the people Peter describes as those who indulge the flesh in its corrupt desires and despise authority. Daring, self-willed, they do not tremble where angels fear to tread. But these, like unreasoning animals born as creatures of instinct to be captured and killed, reviling where they have no knowledge, will in the destruction of those creatures also be destroyed. 2 Peter 2:10-12. All people initially recognize at least some standard of right and wrong and have a certain sense of shame when they act against that standard. Consequently, they usually try to hide their wrongdoing. They may continually fall back into it, but still recognize it as wrong, as something they should not be doing, and their conscience will not let them remain comfortable. But as they continue to overrule conscience and train themselves to do evil and to ignore guilt, they eventually reject those standards and determine to live solely by their own desires. thereby revealing an already seared conscience. Having rejected all divine guidelines and protection, they became depraved in mind and gave themselves over to sensuality. Such a person cares nothing about what other people think, not to mention about what God thinks, but only about what gratifies the cravings of his own warped mind. Ungodliness and immorality destroy the mind, as well as the conscience and the spirit. Rejection of God and of his truth and his righteousness finally results in what Paul refers to in Romans as a depraved mind. A mind that is no mind, that cannot reason, that cannot think clearly, that cannot recognize or understand God's truth, and that loses contact with spiritual reality. In its extreme, the depraved mind loses contact with all reality. When indecency becomes a way of life, every aspect of life is corrupted, distorted, and eventually destroyed. Man is made for God and designed according to his standards. When he rejects God and his standards, he destroys himself in the process. The corruption of our present society are not the result of psychological or sociological circumstances, but it is the result of personal choices based on principles that are specifically and purposely against God and his way. Homosexuality, sexual perversion, abortion, lying, cheating, stealing, murder, and every other type of moral degeneration have become unabashed and calloused ways of life, though the conscious choices of those who indulge in them. Practice can refer to a business enterprise, and that idea could apply here. The ungodly person often makes business out of every kind of impurity. Pornography, prostitution, X-rated films, suggestive TV programs, and every kind of impurity form one of the largest industries in the world. The vast majority of it is open, unashamed, and legally protected. An article in Forbes magazine, September 18, 1978, entitled "The X-Rated Economy" began by stating the obvious. Pornography is no longer an illegal business. The market for pornography is not confined to perverts or other emotional cripples. To the contrary, the largest part of the market is middle-class people. In an increasingly permissive society, those who enjoy pornography are free to revel in it. Impurity is inseparable from greediness. Greediness is unbounded covetousness, uninhibited lust for that which is wanted. Immorality has no part in love, and anything the sensual person does under the guise of caring and helpfulness is but a ruse for exploitation. The world of sensuality and impurity is the world of greediness. The person given over to godlessness and immorality greedily takes whatever he can from those around him. He evaluates life only in material terms, uses other people to his own advantage, and turns his back on God in order to fulfill his own evil desires. When a person determines to think his own way, do things his own way, and pursue his own destiny, he cuts himself off from God. When that happens, he cuts himself off from truth and becomes spiritually blind and without standards of morality. Without standards of morality, immorality becomes a shameless and callous way of life. When that is continued, it destroys the mind's ability to distinguish good from evil, truth from falsehood, and reality from unreality. The godless life becomes the mindless life. That process categorizes every unbeliever. It is the direction that every ungodly person is headed, although some are further along than others. Evil men and impostors will proceed from bad to worse, deceiving and being deceived, 2 Timothy 3:13. That some people may not reach the extremes Paul mentions in Ephesians 4:17-19 is due only to the protective shield of God's common grace that he showers both on the righteous and the unrighteous, and to the preserving influence of the Holy Spirit and of the Church.
Mm-hmm.